Kishore Mahbubani, a well-known expert on Asian and world affairs and also the Dean and Professor of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the University of Singapore, visited China with his new book, The New Asian Hemisphere, The Irresistible Shift of Global Power to the East. Mahbubani served for 33 years in the Singapore Foreign Service, with postings in Cambodia, Malaysia, Washington DC, and twice as ambassador to the United Nations, during which he also served as president of the Security Council. He graduated in philosophy from Singapore and Canada and served as fellow of the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University from 1991 to 1992. He was also listed as one of the top 100 public intellectuals in the world by Foreign Policy magazine. The theme of his new book is how the world has entered into a new era marked by the end of Western domination of world history and the rise of Asia. In an interview with CNC, Professor Mahbubani talked about his perceptions on China's rise, China's relationships with its neighbours and with the existing world powers, and most importantly, on the global governance of the global village, at a time when the world is faced with challenges that impact each and every one in the village.
Since your new book has just been launched, and do you have some future plans? Are there more books to come?
I have decided that the biggest problem that the world faces today is the fact, as I mentioned, that the world is becoming smaller and smaller. We're living in a small global village. And in this small global village, if one house catches fire, other houses will also catch fire. And that's why you see all the problems we face are global problems and cannot be solved by one house on its own. Global warming cannot be solved by one country on its own. Global financial crisis cannot be solved by one country on its own. Pandemics like SARS, H1N1 cannot be solved by one country on its own. Terrorism cannot be solved by one country on its own. So in this global village that we live, all our problems are the global village problems. But each government is designed to take care only of one country or one house in the global village and not the village as a whole. And that's very dangerous, because then you have governments which are taking care of one country and not the village as a whole. So we need to establish stronger global village councils. And so the purpose of my book is to talk about how we can develop, my next book, is about how you can develop greater global governance. So you need a stronger global village council to take care of our global village.
In your book, you have stressed the modernity. And how do you see China's progress in achieving modernity? And what are the remaining challenges?
Well, I think China has actually done very well in modernizing, And I believe that you can have, in the first phase, material modernization. Material modernization is very important. You provide electricity, fresh water, good health facilities, good education facilities, good infrastructure. All that's very important, and that's the first phase of development. And China has been doing very well. And China's universities are also growing rapidly and also doing very well there too. So as you modernize and grow, China will inevitably find that it will have to give leadership in some areas. For example, in science and technology research, I wouldn't be surprised if China is number one in the world in some areas, and therefore you have to provide leadership. And in the case of global governance, managing the world order which has enabled China to grow so fast over the last 30 years. Take the World Trade Organization. I think China will now have a responsibility to make sure the World Trade Organization succeeds and does well, because it would have become one of the world's largest traders already.
So that's the next question I would like to ask you. How do you predict China's development in the future, like in 5 years or even in longer term?
Well, I'm very confident that China will have a larger GNP than America within 20 years, possibly even earlier. Because China is making the correct long-term investments, in your infrastructure, in your education, in science and technology. Whereas in some ways, unfortunately, America is not making the right long-term investments. America has been living on borrowed money, and while China is using its money to invest in the long term, America has been borrowing money to use for current consumption. So which means that future generations will have to pay the price for the current consumption. Whereas in China, the investment you make today will benefit the future generations. So you can see, so that China's future in that sense looks better than America's future. Because America is not investing in the future as much as China is investing in the future. So I'm confident that China will do better and better. But as I mentioned, as you do better and better, the challenge you have is that the world will expect more from you. And I use a very simple image, and I'll give you the simple image, okay? We live in a global village. The global village, as a result of globalization, is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But in the village, there's one house. That house, China, is getting bigger and bigger. So if you live in a global village, and the village is getting smaller and China is getting bigger, the other villages are saying, hey, my space is getting less. And so China must make an effort to understand the impact that its growing size is having on the rest of the world.
So you've just mentioned China has several very valuable longer-term investments. What specifically are these? In what areas?
I think in many areas, I would certainly mention education. I mean, the way, I think if I'm not mistaken, please check these figures. In the mid-1990s, about 5% of your cohort went to university. Now 23% of your cohort go to university. So in 15 years, you've gone from 5% to 23%. No other country in the world has done that, to raise its level of higher education as fast as China has. And then your investment in healthcare is very important, because if you don't have a healthy population, then you're going to have challenges in the future. And certainly your investment in infrastructure has been amazing. It's quite stunning that the world's fastest trains, which used to be in Europe and used to be in Japan, are now in China, right? And that's quite remarkable. And the way, the speed at which you've been creating new infrastructure is mind-boggling. It's much faster. But this doesn't mean that China doesn't have challenges. Okay, let me give you one example of an area where China has a major challenge, which is in the environment. And for example, it's very important that for Beijing to become a world capital, the quality of air in Beijing must be comparable to Washington DC and London and Tokyo. It must be better than the quality of air there. And that's the kind of environmental challenge that China faces now.
How do you think of China's image in Western countries or in the rest of the world? Are there any misconceptions?
China's image in most parts of the world is positive. I have no doubt whatsoever about that. But at the same time, it is a fact that many in the West feel troubled by the rise of China. And as you know, the West has been dominating world history for the last 200 years. And when you've got used to dominating world history, here comes China bouncing back. And China is clearly not a Western power, right? They feel traumatized and worried. And therefore, in some ways, the China has so far risen very well by being very gentle to the rest of the world. And the paradox is that the more powerful you become, the more gentle you have to become. And that's not easy. Because like if you watch America, for example, America preaches all kinds of ideals and principles, right? But it is also, despite the fact that America has been the #1 promoter of international law, America has also violated international law. For example, under international law, it says that you can only use force if it is an act of self-defense or if it's authorized by the UN Security Council. But despite that, America went ahead and invaded Iraq without, even though it's not an act of self-defense, and without the authorization of the UN Security Council. So the war was illegal. And that was a big mistake that the United States made, and by violating international law. So clearly now I think it would be good if China demonstrates and states very clearly and categorically that as China becomes more powerful, it will respect international law.
How do you see China's commitment in following the peaceful development road?
Yeah, I think this is where I've said earlier that China has done a remarkable job over the last 20 years by growing so fast and having peaceful relations with its neighbors. But again, remember, this is unnatural. That when great powers rise, there's normally rising tensions. Let me give you one example, okay? Right now, China should be focused on America because America is the world's largest power, and China is the world's greatest emerging power, right? But American power has peaked. American power from now will go down. It cannot go up, relatively speaking. It can only go down. Only two countries will have power rising at the same time: China and India. And China and India will have the two largest economies by 2050. Now, normally when two powers rise at the same time, there are difficulties. So the challenge for China and India is how they both rise and maintain a peaceful relationship. And here I'm very glad that Premier Wen Jiabao is going to India. And I'm confident that given his close relations between Premier Wen Jiabao and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, that both of them can work together. And Prime Minister Manmohan Singh of India has wisely said the world is big enough for China and India to grow together.
Since the first anniversary of the foundation of China-ASEAN Free Trade Area is coming, so how do you see China and ASEAN relationship, and how do you see its future?
Well, I am actually very optimistic for the future of China's relations with ASEAN, because so far in the last 20 years they have gone from strength to strength. And the China-ASEAN Free Trade Area was a wonderful development. I don't have the exact trade figures, but I understand the trade between China and ASEAN have gone up significantly in the last 12 months since the FTA was signed. And as you know, the China-ASEAN Free Trade Area is the largest free trade area in the whole world because it has 1.9 billion people in that free trade area. And therefore it's important for that free trade area to succeed because it will be a model for other free trade areas.
In your new book, you had mentioned China has done a good job in sharing prosperity with its neighbors in Asia. So is this China-ASEAN Free Trade Area a case in the point?
Yes, definitely. And but you see, it's not just ASEAN. China's trade with Korea, China's trade with Japan, China's trade with India has gone up dramatically, and that's actually quite remarkable. Everyone would have expected that when China first opened up and modernized its economy, that its trade with the United States would grow, its trade with Europe would grow, and that's grown too. But China's trade with its neighbors has grown much faster than with other parts of the world, and that's a very good sign because it means that there's a very high degree of interdependency developing in Asia, and interdependency is a good thing.
How do you evaluate current Sino-US relationship, and how do you see its future?
The most difficult relationship in the world is always between the world's greatest power and the world's greatest emerging power. The world's greatest power today is the United States of America. The world's greatest emerging power is China. And so, throughout history, that relationship has always been very difficult. But what is remarkable is that so far we have an unnatural situation in the US-China relationship, where even though China has been rising very fast, the US-China relationship overall has been quite stable. Now this takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to keep relationship between US and China stable. And the world is happy that that has been so. But we cannot expect it to always be so. You should expect difficulties to emerge. And as you have seen, they have emerged recently in the recent congressional elections in November of this year. There was a lot of China bashing that went on. And that's very dangerous, the China bashing that went on in the US congressional elections. And that's something we need to make sure is stopped. But I understand that President Hu Jintao is going to visit the United States of America. And if, for example, China is seen as a positive investor in the United States of America, creating jobs in America through Chinese investment, that will help to stabilize the relationship.
How do you see the results of the just concluded Cancun conference?
Well, I was just listening on the television. It just finished, as you know, a couple of hours ago, and they've announced a $100 billion deal to help the poor countries. I think it's a start, but that's not going to solve the global warming problem. The global warming problem can only be resolved if the richest countries in the world, especially United States and Europe, reduce their per capita emissions. And then the developing countries, China and India, they cannot reduce their per capita emissions, but they can reduce the growth in their per capita emissions. And that's a challenge, because the only way to do that is to make the wealthy countries pay an economic price and make the poorer countries pay an economic price. But the poorer countries must pay less of an economic price than the wealthy countries. But as you know, in the United States of America, if any politician says, I am going to tax your gasoline consumption just $1 a gallon, right? The cheapest solution for America is a $1 solution, $1 a gallon. But not one single American politician dares to advocate a $1 a gallon solution, because it would be political suicide in America. So if the wealthiest countries cannot make any kind of economic sacrifice, right, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how can you ask the poorer countries to make an economic sacrifice? That's the challenge in global warming. And up to now, no Western leader has provided enough leadership in this area.
So how do you see China's efforts and obligations in tackling global warming?
I think it is natural that since China is emerging as the world's greatest power, you have the second largest GNP in the world. Soon you'll have the largest GNP in the world. And as I said, when you live in a small global village that is getting smaller, with China getting bigger, the rest of the world will expect China to do more. And here, in some ways, China has been very wise in investing in green technology before being asked to do so.